to be leading our aquatic resources discussion today related to the Zigzag Integrated Resource Project, which is a timber sale proposed in Mount Hood National Forest. The comment period for this project ends on August 10th. So be aware of that while we're going through the discussion, be taking notes and be prepared to start writing your comments soon because August 10th will come up quick. So a little bit about BARC. BARC's mission is to transform Mount Hood National Forest into a place where natural processes prevail, where wildlife thrives, and where local communities have a social, cultural, and economic investment in its restoration and preservation. Since 1999, BARC has organized people from communities around Mount Hood National Forest to keep watch over the ecological conditions of the forest and the actions of the federal agency tasked with managing these public lands, the Forest Service. And you can see the Facebook and Instagram handles for BARC at the bottom of the screen here. So please go follow both of those to get updates on other things that BARC is doing. There's a lot of other community events and actions related to the many proposed actions within Mount Hood. One of the practices that BARC incorporates is to acknowledge the role of our indigenous peoples of Oregon and the Columbia River Basin. So we are going to take a few minutes and we're going to go through an acknowledgement practice. As an organization founded by white people in the settler colonial lineage, BARC is part of the legacy of land theft and the erasure of national authority over the lands now referred to as the public lands of Mount Hood National Forest. As an organization, we have established influential relationships with the Forest Service, part of the same federal government which facilitated the violent land theft, colonization, and displacement of indigenous people. Non-native Barkers have access and privilege to this land because of this violent legacy. We are working to transform our organization to take responsibility for this legacy and these unearned privileges. We are learning to practice acknowledgement, respect, and support for the Molallas, Kalapuyans, Chinookan Clackamas, Chinookan Wascos, Northern Paiute peoples, and Sahaptin speaking peoples who live here and who have always lived here, and the many other Native nations who have always been part of and cared for this land that we now occupy. So right now I would like to invite anyone who is of Native descent and would like to speak to say a few words, whatever comes to mind, comes to heart, related to this topic. And we'll give a few seconds for anyone to speak up who would like to do that. You can raise your hand or unmute yourself. If no Native people would like to speak about this topic right now, then I would like to invite all of the non-Native people on this call to take 1 minute of silence to reflect on this acknowledgement practice and to really think about the role that we play and why we're here talking about conserving natural resources in an area that was previously stewarded by Native peoples and is now owned and operated by the federal government, and our role as non-Native peoples in this. So we'll take 1 minute and just quietly consider all of this. Okay, so I hope that we all had a little moment of reflection to think about why we're here today and talking about hopefully conserving some of these natural resources that are important to not only the ecosystem, but also to the people who previously were stewards of this land and should still have input into the resources that we are impacting with our actions. As you stated earlier, we're here to talk about the Zigzag Integrated Resource Project and specifically the aquatic resources that may be impacted by the proposed actions of the Forest Service. So BARC has put this together as a series of resource impacts that will be happening throughout the comment period. And again, the comment period ends on August 10th. So if you would like to comment on any of the other resource impacts in your comment, then please join those other calls and you'll get some great information about all of the resources that could potentially be impacted by this project. Like I said, my name is Ashley. A little bit about my background. I'm a biologist and environmental consultant. So basically my job is to write these NEPA documents as kind of a subcontractor for federal agencies that aren't proposing their own actions. So the Forest Service writes their own NEPA documents because they're proposing this action. But for private companies that are proposing actions like pipelines and things, a lead federal agency will contract someone to write those documents. So I have familiarity with the NEPA process, and I'm excited to kind of walk you guys through some of the ins and outs of NEPA and to pick apart the analysis that the Forest Service provided. Our agenda for today, we're going to do a very brief overview of what NEPA is, just to kind of put things in perspective, put public comment writing into perspective, and sort of focus on what we should be including in our comments. We'll have a brief period for questions related to just kind of the public comment process in NEPA in general, if you have questions about that. And then we'll go straight into the proposed action and the Zigzag project itself, go over impacts to waters and impacts to the aquatic species that inhabit those waters. And then we'll have time for more questions and your thoughts at the end. The National Environmental Policy Act, which I'll be calling NEPA from now on, is actually the first major environmental law that the United States ever enacted. It was put forth by Nixon in 1969, and it really laid the framework for the rest of the environmental policies that we see today in the United States. That was also, I believe 1970 was the year that Earth Day was first founded, so it was a pretty big time for environmentalism and sort of just the world waking up to the potential impacts that we have on our natural resources. What NEPA does is it really is just it's more of a disclosure law than anything. So it requires federal agencies to disclose an assessment, a scientifically based assessment of the potential impacts of any proposed action that's considered to have a federal nexus. So the agencies have to disclose the effects of their proposed actions, but NEPA does not require any specific decision based on those. So even if all of the impacts disclosed in a NEPA document were found to be significant for a resource, that doesn't mean that the federal government has the responsibility to deny that project. So the level of impact is really, it's not there to decide if the project should happen or not. It's more to frame the project and disclose the impacts. And the other part of NEPA, the purpose is to allow the public to comment. So previously, before NEPA, the public had no really input or visual on what the government was proposing or what they were doing. So we had no idea what our own government was doing to our natural resources, which we all share. We all taxpayers in this country. We all require these resources to survive. Clean water, clean air, things like that are all shared resources. So it allowed the public to really have an input for the first time. The products of a NEPA analysis, categorical exclusion is the most common. It just means that the federal agency found that there would likely be no impact based on previous projects that they've looked at that had similar descriptions. So I'm not going to go into that one, but it is the most common, but there's really no NEPA analysis conducted for a categorical exclusion. The next level is environmental assessment, which is what the Forest Service issued for this project. And it's the precursor to the larger and more detailed environmental impact statement. But it can also just be a standalone document for many projects like the Forest Service's projects generally are not escalated into environmental impact statements. So probably For this project, for example, all we'll be seeing is the environmental assessment. So, brief overview of public comments. So the public comments are really your right to have a say in what your government is doing with your natural resources. So you have the power. It's not a vote. It does not count toward the decision. Regardless of what the public comments, the government can make any decision they want. So it's not a vote, but it is a way to highlight flaws in an analysis that an agency has conducted and potentially get certain areas or sensitive resources mitigated or proposed actions altered, and sometimes thrown out altogether based on public comments and input. So your comments should focus on the purpose and need of the proposed action, which we will go into for specifically aquatic resources, what that is. The proposed alternatives, which is probably the thing that we, for this project, will want to focus on the most. We'll go into that as well. The assessment of environmental impacts. So has the agency used the most current science? Have they cherry-picked data? Have they framed the data in a way that sort of achieves a result that they would like more than an objective assessment? Have they just left things out? That's our job, to look at what they've done and see if we think it's adequate. And any proposed mitigation. So if they're proposing an action and they're saying it may have an effect, how are they going to mitigate that effect? To write an effective comment or a substantive comment, we need to provide information about the proposed action. Is there any newer science that has come up since the Forest Service issued their environmental assessment, or maybe they used old data because it fit better with their narrative? So we need to do a little digging and kind of be aware of those things as we're going through. Is there a different way to meet the need of the proposed project? Are there any flaws in their analysis? Are there things that they missed intentionally or unintentionally? Is how they framed the data strange? I can tell you there's a couple things we'll go into where, yes, the way that they framed the data is strange and probably framed in a way that will achieve the result that they're looking for. So that's what we need to look out for especially. And if we think of any alternatives that are feasible and both economically and just practically, and they would also achieve the purpose and need, then those are considered feasible alternatives and should be part of the analysis. We should bring those up. And if we identify any flaws or false facts or anything like that, we definitely need to bring those to the attention of the Forest Service in our comment. So in summary, to have an effective or substantive comment, you need to be clear in your language, concise, objective. So try not to go on rants or opinions. You can certainly put that in there, but you should also have some sort of factually and scientifically grounded argument as well. And remember to always be respectful in your comment. It does diminish the credibility of your comment if you have disrespectful language or kind of aggressive language. Just try to stay away from that. Stay impartial, be purely scientific, and the facts will speak for themselves. And your comment should be strictly related to the project. The Forest Service is in no way obligated to address any comments that are outside of what they called the scope of the project, which they did mention in their comment response. There's a couple things that they were like, well, people commented on this, but it's outside of the scope of the project, so we didn't analyze it. And so just don't waste your time commenting on anything that's outside of the project itself. And of course, everything you put in your comment should be based on reliable, current scientific data. And you should always cite your sources, because if you don't, Forest Service can easily come back and say, well, we don't know where you got that from, so we don't have to analyze what you said. So we're going to take a minute now. If anyone has questions about NEPA process or what your comment should look like or anything related to those topics before we go into the project itself, go ahead and raise your hand or unmute yourself.
We have one question in the chat already.
Cool.
Which is about the categorical exclusions. The question is, are there any reviews of categorical exclusion? Is anyone being held accountable when it's a categorical exclusion?
Yes and no. There's no public comment period on categorical exclusions. It's all done internally within the federal government. So yes, there is oversight for categorical exclusions within the government itself, but it's not something that the public has an opportunity to have a say in. So it's basically the federal government decides if a categorical exclusion is appropriate for a proposed action within the agency. It's not done by any other public process. So yes and no. If that's enough oversight, sometimes it isn't, but that's the system we have. So
Camilo, you have a question?
Yeah, I heard on the news that President Trump was going to do something to roll back rules involving NEPA.
Yeah, yeah, he's proposed several of these now over the last couple of years, and basically the things that he's proposing are pretty outlandish, and they definitely will be challenged and brought to court. So it'll be quite a while before any of those things are actually enacted, if ever, hopefully not. But it's one of our jobs to push back on those things. So also raise your voice about any proposed NEPA alterations. But basically what he's trying to do is streamline the process. So one part of that is actually eliminating the public comment period for certain types of projects, trying to make the NEPA process much shorter. So shortening the length, the maximum length of NEPA documents. I think 300 pages was a number that he threw around, which, as you can see from just this environmental assessment, which is the first phase, it's not even an EIS, environmental impact statement, it's just an environmental assessment. And it's well over 300 pages, including all of the appendices and specialist reports and things like that. So that's one way that he is trying to kind of cut the NEPA process down, is just limiting the amount of analysis you can do, which undermines the entire purpose of NEPA, which is to disclose impacts. And there's certain categories for different projects, particularly pipeline projects, where he is trying to push those through and basically limit the amount of time that an agency has to respond. So if, for example, Fish and Wildlife Service doesn't respond within like a week or 30 days to a request for a consultation about potentially affected species, then he's trying to make it so that that pushes it into another category of, well, they've decided that they're not going to participate in this project. And so now that phase of NEPA is over, which is, it's really not, it's not the way that things should work at all, because the agencies are already understaffed and under budgeted, and it takes them a long time to respond for a reason. It's not because they're trying to obstruct the NEPA process and make things difficult for companies trying to do this work. It's because they don't have the resources to respond most of the time. So it's basically just trying to undermine the process so that companies can have their private interests without having to pay for the expensive process or wait a long time. So those will be challenged in court, but hopefully they don't happen. Are there any other questions?
There are no questions in the chat. Does anyone else have a question related to commenting, the act, the process of commenting through the National Environmental Policy Act? Seems like no. So people are clear on that part. Yes, the slides will be available. along with a lot of other resources related to helping you write your comment. And Ashley, if you want to just continue on and get into the nitty-gritty about what is proposed, that'll be great.
Yeah. So get into it. So this is called a preliminary, well, they called it preliminary assessment, but it's a preliminary environmental assessment. You could think of it as a draft environmental assessment, as some other agencies like to call it. So basically, this is the first draft of this environmental assessment document. And then once the public comments on it and the Forest Service goes out and does some surveys while this is happening and everything, like they'll incorporate all of that new data and comments into the final draft. So right now we are in what you should consider the draft phase of this. So the proposed action for aquatic resources is primarily riparian habitat enhancement. So the purpose and need is described as the riparian areas are not meeting the desired condition, which is defined, has a specific definition in the forest plan, but they're designated as not meeting the desired condition of multi-layer canopy with large diameter trees, a well-developed understory, more than one H-class, and sufficient quantities of snags and down woody debris. The proposed action to remedy this issue and achieve the desired condition of riparian areas is that mostly that there's an inadequate amount of large woody debris in streams. So in areas that lack desired levels of large wood, trees would be felled adjacent in adjacent upland areas to create better quality riparian structure. So basically, they're going to cut down trees in areas outside of what's considered the riparian zone, which is referred to as an upland area. They're going to cut down trees there and then take them and put them into streams to create better quality habitat. And then they're also proposing thinning within riparian reserves to accelerate and promote the desired conditions. So basically the thinning would adjust the factors like multi-layer canopy with large diameter trees. One of the things they said was that a lot of the trees right now in riparian reserves are not growing fast enough because they are being choked out by the trees next to them. And so their argument is that thinning some of those trees would allow the other trees room to grow. They're saying that this would also promote a well-developed understory, providing more open canopy and more sunlight to go down into the understory to promote those herb plant growths, non-tree plant growths, and then more than one age class. So if all of the trees right now in these riparian areas are the same diameter, they're also likely the same age. So what they're saying is in areas like that that are really uniform, they would like to see different age classes of trees. And then the woody debris would come from the felling of other trees. Thinning would actually diminish the amount of large woody debris and snags that would be available for riparian habitat. So that's also one thing to consider. One of the things that we want to be looking at is, would these proposed actions actually achieve the purpose and need? And if they would over time, would not doing anything also achieve this over time? Because not doing anything is less detrimental to the resources in the area, obviously. So here's an example. This is from BARC's comments on the scoping period. These are pictures that BARC has taken from two different units, 88 and 62, that actually have sufficient large woody debris in them. So this is basically what the Forest Service is saying they want our riparian areas to look like. And they're saying that there is insufficient amounts of these large woody debris right now. This is a diagram that the Forest Service included in their specialist reports. This is of the horseshoe area, and everything in red is the riparian thinning. So these would be the areas where they would selectively cut down trees. They would not be clear cutting, just thinning, but they would be cutting down trees within these riparian areas. And pay attention to the fact that many of these are on the Clear Fork River, which is one of the rivers of concern for our analysis later. And this is the Mud Creek area. This map is showing the riparian thinning again in riparian areas, and Mud Creek is another stream that is a concern. That the Clear Fork and Mud Creek were two of the streams that were the most concerning, actually, in the analysis of the existing baseline conditions and potential impacts. And we'll go into those. So one of the interesting things I wanted to bring up, just kind of as a way to view your analysis when you're looking at what they're saying, is looking at the alternatives. So alternatives are, every NEPA document has to have an analysis of what would happen if we just did nothing at all. Like, is there some kind of really detrimental thing that's occurring, like this pipe is leaking into the river, and if we do nothing at all, then it would continue leaking and cause pollution, and if the action alternative would be repair it, like that sort of thing. So the no action alternative in this case, they described as, with no action, large wood recruitment potential and riparian function would continue to remain low in the short term, about 10 years, and would improve in the midterm, 10 to 100 years, and in the long term. So basically, in the short term, less than 10 years, the function of these riparian areas would still remain like not functioning quite where they want it to, but given natural succession, which we know from just how forests work, if you leave them to their own devices, they will create the habitat that the creatures that live there need. And it's just the laws of ecology on planet Earth. So if you leave things alone, the habitat will be there eventually. The action alternative is, the result of it would be timber felling would have an unsubstantial effect on large woody debris frequency and recruitment in the short term, which is interesting because the short term is the only issue in the no action alternative. And they're saying that an unsubstantial effect would be seen from the action alternative in that same time period. So what's the difference? Why are they doing it? Something to bring up in your comments. We would also see a positive effect on large woody debris frequency and recruitment in the midterm, 10 to 100 years, and long term, greater than 100 years. And that would be due to accelerated development of late sterile characteristics and the production of large diameter wood that would likely occur under the no action alternative. So what these two things are saying are pretty similar. They're saying that these production of large diameter wood would occur within the no action alternative as well, within basically the same time period. So the biggest question for me after this analysis is, why are we doing this to begin with? Why are we thinning trees in riparian areas if thinning trees in riparian areas would have an unsubstantial effect on large woody debris in streams? So, which is the goal of this action, apparently. So take from that what you will, but one of the things that we have to remember from Forest Service projects like this is that they have timber quotas to meet, and sometimes they have to think of creative ways to frame their actions as restoration projects or resource enhancement, when in actuality, they really just need an excuse to cut down some trees to meet their quota and get funding for the next year. So it puts them in a bad spot because as ecologists and scientists, most of the time, it pains them to do this. They don't want to have to cut down trees, but every presidential administration, not just Donald Trump's administration, does put a timber quota for Forest Service units. And if they don't meet that, they don't get budget for the next year to pay their employees to do actual management and restoration work. So keep that in mind and look at all of these proposed actions within that context. So we're going to start looking at impacts. We're going to start with water quantity. So that's things like stream flow, peak stream flow or average stream flow, things like flooding events. So for flooding, most of the project is in what they called the transient snow zone, which is an area where sudden snow melts causes flooding. So these are areas where in late winter, early spring, when we start to get freshet flows and snow melts, a sudden rain event where warm rainwater is hitting snow and the temperatures are such that the snow will start melting and running into the rivers and streams, that can cause a sudden increase in water runoff, and so much so that it's not able to be absorbed into the ground quick enough, and it can cause flooding of streams. And most of the project is within that zone of potential flood risk. And one of the other compounding factors of that is that open canopy increases the amount of snow that accumulates on the ground in the understory of forests, which makes sense. Denser trees, you see less snow on the ground. And when there's a lot of snow on the ground, especially when there's a lot of snow on the ground, suddenly in a season where typically last year there were a bunch of trees there covering it, that also increases flood risk. So if you have a foot of snow on the ground in a forest and you're on a steep slope and you're next to a stream, and all of a sudden you get a rain event, that all of that snow that's available to melt is going to flow down into the stream. Whereas if the canopy were denser, that wouldn't happen as much. Roads also divert runoff into streams, and there's a lot of roads that are being proposed for this project. So you can see how an impermeable surface like a road kind of channelizes that water and directs it straight down into a stream, and that can cause flooding. So they specified that the Clear Fork, Mud Creek, and West and East Fork Salmon River are all above the threshold of concern for flooding. So think back to those project maps I showed you earlier. Clear Fork and Mud Creek are the two areas that have the most riparian thinning proposed in them. So that seems like a compounding factor that could cause more flooding. So things we should focus on when we're talking about comments, are there alternatives to riparian thinning in these areas that are above the threshold of concern for flooding? Why are we trying to log in areas that are already susceptible to flooding? That is something that we should ask them. And increasing buffers. So they've already proposed buffers for each stream based on stream characteristics and the typical trees that usually live there. But what if we're increasing the buffers even more? What if we're just not logging adjacent to riparian areas? That would eliminate this problem. So those are alternatives that you can bring up in your comment. Another factor for water quantity impacts is stream flow. So I directly took this from the report because I really wanted to just highlight all of it. This is a great breakdown of really checking the analysis and using your own common sense to look at what they're saying and see if it makes sense. So basically, one of the first things I'll say is that this is from Perry and Jones, 2017. It's a paper that was published in 2017 that did a analysis over a 60-year period of 8 watersheds in this area. So it is relevant to the project area. But basically what they did for this analysis, I think it was one of the weaker sections in the water quality specialist report, they pretty much copy pasted the abstract of that paper, which is, I mean, you can do that if it's good information and it's pertinent, but that's pretty much the extent of their analysis. Was they copy pasted the abstract and then they put in this table that showed the percent of the area cumulatively clear cut with the addition of the proposed action. So first, I'd like to point out that their argument here basically says that watersheds in the project area that were less than 50% clear cut that's what they're using as their threshold of analysis. So they're considering anything that's been less than 50% clear cut to be irrelevant to their analysis, simply because the paper that they cited, that was the threshold that they used. And that's the extent. So they didn't analyze anything that was clear cut less than 50%. And the reason why that's an issue is that you can see here in red in this table, the Clear Fork River cumulatively after the proposed action will be 47% clear cut. So basically they threw that out the window and said, well, Perry and Jones only looked at things that were 50% clear cut or greater. So 47% means nothing, like there's no impact. It's irrelevant, we don't need to analyze it. And I think anyone with common sense can say 47% rounded up is 50%. So saying that because they're not cutting 3% more of this Clear Fork area, that there would be no impacts at all is, I mean, I don't know if it's intentionally deceptive, but it's a deceptive way to interpret this paper, because that's not what Perry and Jones were saying. They're not saying that everything less than 50% clear cut is peachy and everything's fine. 47% is a large number and should be analyzed based on the impacts that could have. So in your comment, that's something that you could point out is, well, you need to do in the final draft, please do an analysis of the Clear Fork River and the effects of clear cutting 47% of that area and how that would affect stream flow, because it's almost 50%. And it's similar with Mud Creek. Mud Creek is at 30% after the project is all said and done, which is, it's pretty high. I mean, it's not quite 47%, but there's going to be an impact if you're clear cutting 30% of something. I will point out that the project itself is really just compounding these existing baseline clear cuts. So they're not going in and clear cutting 47% of the Clear Fork watershed in this project alone. I think the Clear Fork watershed was already at 46% clear cut by the time this project was proposed. But cumulatively, which is part of the NEPA analysis, cumulative impacts, cumulatively, past projects have already clear cut 46% of this watershed. So why are we proposing more logging that could bring us even closer to this 50% threshold where we would see deficits in stream flow? So this is one example of a way to perform an analysis. Like, go look at the papers that they're citing. This paper was like 5 pages long. It's pretty easy to read. It had some interesting things to say, and their interpretation of it was pretty darn subjective. And scientifically, we want to be objective. So something to consider in your comment. The next impact we're going to talk about is sedimentation. So sedimentation is one of the, well, let's say one of, it is the leading cause of stream pollution in the world. Sedimentation above chemicals or heavy metals or anything like that, sedimentation is the #1 pollutant of all streams. It comes from roads, it comes from natural activities like landslides and flooding events, and it's really an issue for water quality. It's an issue for aquatic species, being able to survive and reproduce in waters that are experiencing really high turbidity or high sediment loads. So this is something we really want to look at. And there are a few concerning things that they highlighted. So the first thing, an easy kind of low-hanging fruit, they explicitly stated in the document that there's not been a survey of Mud Creek bank stabilization, while all of the other tributaries and streams and things have apparently had surveys done at some point in the past. Some of them were in the 90s, it's a little outdated. But Mud Creek itself has never had a proper field analysis of bank stability. And Mud Creek, as we said earlier, is above the threshold of concern for flooding. So if we're talking about one of the major areas where they're proposing thinning, and it's in an area that's above the threshold of concern for flooding already, and they haven't even looked at how stable the banks are at Mud Creek, who's to say that the sedimentation wouldn't be an issue and that this project wouldn't destabilize banks because of increased peak flow and increased sedimentation. So things like that, just go back and say, in the final draft, we need to see a proper fields survey of Mud Creek. Tell us what the stability of the banks are. What's the risk? Because that's part of an analysis, is to see what the risk is for these banks and if they're going to contribute to sedimentation. So sedimentation would occur at Clear Fork and Mud Creek during work. So in the specialist report, they explicitly said that the effects of sedimentation would likely only be seen for a short period during construction, during logging, during construction of roads, things like that. And then after they would return to baseline conditions, or some creeks are actually, they're hoping that sedimentation decreases due to road decommissioning and things like that. So one of the questions we need to ask is, if sedimentation is very likely going to increase at these creeks that are already in jeopardy during work, then why aren't we proposing mitigation in the form of doing this work outside of sensitive spawning times for salmon, whose critical habitat is in this area? So we'll go into that later, but sedimentation affects salmon quite a lot. And one of the most common, and just like NEPA projects in general, one of the most common forms of wildlife mitigation is just to do the work when it's not breeding season, because that's when they're most vulnerable. So that's a piece of mitigation that we could potentially pose in our comments. Going back into it, sections of the Muddy Fork already have, Muddy Fork and Mud Creek are different, just make that distinction, but sections of the Muddy Fork already have greater than 10% unstable stream banks, 19 to 13%. Threshold of concern is 20% for really like serious impacts. So they're getting up there. Greater than 10% unstable stream banks, and increased sedimentation and embeddedness. Again, threshold of concern is 20%. The sedimentation level in Muddy Fork is 12% right now, and embeddedness, which is basically how covered, like how much sediment is actually covering all of the larger like pebbles and stuff and that make up the stream bed. How buried are they? And that's at 17%, and 20% is threshold of concern. So again, we're really approaching that that area. I would say we're in the yellow orange area for threshold of concern on those. So we really need to ask them for further analysis of the potential for this project to push the sediment levels it's really a small amount. So push them from 12 and 17% into that 20% range where the stream is considered at that point no longer performing its ecological function. And that's a really serious issue, considering that these areas are critical habitat for threatened salmon species that taxpayers and the Forest Service have spent years, decades, and billions of dollars trying to restore this habitat. So we really need to ask them to do a better job of analyzing that and say, why are you not going further into this if we're at 17% and 20% is the threshold? How can you say that this project is not going to increase that by that 3% and push us into unsuitable habitat for these threatened species? And one of the final things that, I mean, we could go into this pretty deeply, but they really did not address the fact that a lot of the logging that they're proposing is on steep slopes that are adjacent to these streams. So steep slopes, as common sense would tell you, have a higher potential for sedimentation to occur during, like we were talking about, with these flooding events with snow melts, or just in general, when you're taking all of these root systems out of an area, it destabilizes the soil, and that will lead to higher rates of soil particles falling into the water. So they really didn't go into that very much about the actual slopes of their proposed logging and the potential effects of that on water quality. So I think we just need to ask them to revisit that. And you could go into quite a bit of detail, and I would suggest citing some sources and finding some people that say slope stability from tree harvest is an issue, just to kind of push them into doing a better analysis. So go into aquatic species. So we have several threatened salmon and steelhead species. We have critical habitat in the area. We have Pacific lamprey, which are, I believe, a species of concern, certainly of management concern, I think, for the Forest Service, but I don't think they're federally listed. But the Forest Service does have quite a few projects ongoing along the Columbia River and things like that for Pacific lamprey rehabilitation. And I'd like to talk a little bit about what this means. So we have Chinook, coho, steelhead, and cutthroat trout, which are federally protected, and some of these have critical habitat in the area. And they made a determination of may affect, but not likely to adversely affect. So this is standard language, boilerplate language that every NEPA document uses when they're analyzing impacts to wildlife. So it can range from no effect, may affect, not likely to adversely affect, may affect, likely to adversely affect, which would essentially be a significant effect. So they're saying that this may affect, not likely to adversely affect, is the case for all of these species. And it's important to look at this from the perspective of people writing these NEPA documents. So personally, as someone who has worked with federal agencies to write these documents, the main goal, unfortunately, is to frame your analysis in any way possible to achieve may affect, not likely to adversely affect. Anything greater than that, may affect, likely to adversely affect, things of that nature. Anything greater than that is considered significant, and it requires a whole slew of just higher levels of mitigation. It requires really taking a harder look at the proposed action and if it should even be occurring in that area. And it's basically saying that we're going to detrimentally affect these populations and potentially impact the viability of these populations in this area. And that's something that violates the Endangered Species Act. So a federal agency is not, it's their duty to avoid at all costs negatively affecting a population of federally protected wildlife in such a way that might jeopardize the viability of that population. So population meaning not the entire species, like Chinook are not going to go extinct because of this project, but this population, this group of Chinook that frequent the streams in the project area and utilize them for spawning and habitat and things like that, that specific population could be in jeopardy due to the proposed action. So that determination likely to adversely affect is absolutely just acid on any project. Like they just try to avoid it so much. So looking at the analysis, you can kind of, from that lens, you can kind of start picking out like they're framing this in a weird way, or they're not looking at all of these impacts as like compounding factors. They're looking at them separately so that all of them are below the threshold of concern and therefore not significant, even though when you combine them all, things like bank stability and flooding potential and things like that combined, those are an issue. But when we're talking about them separately, maybe you can keep them below the threshold of concern. So I think that was done, that practice was apparent in a lot of this analysis. So that's something certainly that if you feel like you have the ability to voice that in your comment, then certainly do it, because may affect, not likely to adversely affect is not necessarily true across the entire project. For certain streams, sure, but for things like the Clear Fork and Mud Creek, with all of the issues that we went over earlier, I don't think that this is a proper determination. And then Pacific Lamprey, they really shouldn't be affected too much. They have a higher tolerance for a lot of these different environmental factors like sedimentation and stuff. So they generally utilize the same habitat and things like that as the salmon and steelhead do. So they're kind of lumped during the analysis into the analysis for those species. So just keep that in mind for all NEPA documents you read. These determinations do have definitions on the NEPA website, the federal government's website, and you can go there and look at them, but they are very subjective and they can be used in a way that it's just not quite the truth. Anything to achieve a non-significant result, really. So that said, we have critical habitat for several species here. But then this is within the Horseshoe area and the Sandy Headwaters watershed. So you can see all the proposed units are in orange, and the Clear Fork and Muddy Fork were two that we discussed earlier. Really not much proposed on the Muddy Fork, but the Clear Fork is just, I mean, there's a lot of steep slopes there. There's critical habitat, there are riparian reserves. And the Clear Fork is, like they said, susceptible to flooding. It already has higher sedimentation rates just at baseline without this project being done. It's at 46% currently of clear cut within that watershed. And like we said earlier, at 50% clear cut, Perry and Jones, that one paper, found that at 50% clear cut, stream flow was actually reduced by 50%. And one of the things we know about salmon is that they heavily rely on stream flow to indicate when they're supposed to spawn and where they're supposed to go, to maintain water temperature. Shallower streams, as you can imagine, usually have more susceptibility to temperature increases, and salmon are incredibly sensitive to warmer temperatures. So things like that are big concerns. And here we are with steelhead and steelhead critical habitat along a lot of these planning units. So that's definitely something to keep in mind during your comments. It's pointing things out like critical habitat would be affected, has a federal, it's within the federal jurisdiction, and it's one of the directives of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is to ensure as they would be considered a cooperating agency. So they're not the agency actually perpetrating these actions, but they have a responsibility to perform their own oversight of the project from a federal perspective, because there are federally threatened and critical habitats listed within the project area. So that triggers Fish and Wildlife's responsibility to protect those resources. That's what they're tasked with. And if they see a project like this, where a bunch of critical habitat for these species could be impacted, then they have a responsibility to intervene. So that's something to keep in mind in your comment, calling that out and saying there's a federal obligation to protect these species is one of the tools that we can use to really push them into having to consider these, because it's not just our opinion. They have a federal obligation to protect this wildlife. So that said, going into fish impacts, this ties into all of the water quality specialist report impacts that we went over earlier, but we'll just kind of bring these out into a fisheries context. So higher peak stream flow is correlated to higher rates of salmon embryo mortality. Peak stream flow meaning it's not the average stream flow throughout the season, but when the freshet is running off of all the snowpack in Mount Hood and increasing water volume in our streams. Higher peak stream flow, basically higher sedimentation from all of that snow melt combining with sediment as it flows down into these streams, is correlated with higher salmon embryo mortality. So that in itself is because, one of the reasons is because salmon embryos that are trying to develop in heavily sedimentated streams, really turbid streams, they have reduced availability of oxygen when they're buried, essentially. So if you have a stream that has a bunch of these redds or salmon nests in them, and then they just have exposed eggs sitting in basically these shallow little depressions that the salmon dig in gravel in the stream bed, and they have no other protection. So if you're experiencing higher peak stream flow and higher sediment loading into a stream, and those embryos are getting buried, they don't have access to oxygen. And that has been shown numerous times in many different studies to be linked to just poor development and lack of recruitment. So they said themselves in the fisheries report that timber harvest and construction of roads specifically are positively correlated with higher peak stream flow. So basically, through common sense, we can say timber harvest and construction of roads equals higher peak stream flow, which equals higher sedimentation. That down the chain equals lower recruitment of salmon, which we already have an issue with in this area. It's one of our most threatened and most important resources economically and ecologically and culturally. So endangering further this population that we have spent a lot of resources to restore is a huge concern. The next point, significant reduction in embryo survival for Chinook, cutthroat, and steelhead trout. The fine sediment concentration reaches 15 to 20%. So that's tying back into low recruitment of salmon embryos, sedimentation. So they're actually putting a number on it. This is from the report itself. They stated that if fine sediment concentration reaches 15 to 20%, then that's when we start worrying about salmon embryo mortality. And like we talked about earlier, Muddy Creek is already at 12% and has unstable banks. So not to be confused with Mud Creek, who has not had the bank stability survey done yet. Muddy Creek has had a bank stability survey done, and it was found to have unstable banks. 10% or greater of the bank area, bank length of Muddy Creek is unstable. And it's already at 12% concentration of sedimentation, basically meaning it has 12% turbidity, which is the cloudiness of the water if you're going from a visual perspective. So 12% suspended sediments and unstable banks in Muddy Creek. Those are big concerns. We're approaching 15%, which is the threshold of concern. They quantified the amount of sedimentation that would occur in Muddy Creek, and it was maybe 1 or 2% of an increase from the background level of 12%. And so they're basically saying, similar to what we were looking at with Perry and Jones, they're basically saying, well, it's not 15, so it's fine, which is just not true. And as an agency who is tasked with managing these resources and keeping them at a healthy functioning level, that's the priority of their management directive. They should be very concerned about doing anything in this area that would make Muddy Creek worse, because Muddy Creek is already in what they've called like an at-risk functioning state. So it's almost there, and they've acknowledged that, but now they're proposing to do things that could increase sedimentation. So one of the things that we talked about earlier, why, if all of this increased sedimentation is going to occur during the project, like when they're physically removing trees and constructing roads and like before everything is stabilized and said and done, if that's when the sedimentation is going to occur, why aren't we proposing mitigation that would include conducting this work outside of the spawning windows for these threatened salmon and steelhead? Because if the embryos are not in the stream, they've already hatched and swam away by the time they're doing the work, then this really doesn't have as big of an effect, because they, from their model, they've extrapolated out into the future and actually have shown that their stabilization and decommissioning of some of these roads would reduce long-term sedimentation in certain creeks. So if it's really just a time issue, why aren't they proposing mitigation for this? So definitely comment on that. And again, they really didn't go into the factor of this slope stability on these steep slopes that are above these creeks. So these are all things that put water quality at risk and our threatened salmon at risk. And lastly, just to bring it full circle, they've stated that riparian thinning, which is the main contributor to all of these impacts, riparian thinning wouldn't significantly improve desired riparian habitat conditions, at least in the short term, versus the no action alternative. They basically said that the no action alternative and the proposed action are almost the same within the 10-year time period that they specified for short term, which is what they're concerned about right now. So why are we even trying to do this if it's going to have all of these effects? My my thought after all of this is sort of proposing to them to actually get rid of most of these proposed thinning in riparian reserves along the Clear Fork and Mud Creek areas, because there's just too many effects, and the demonstrated positive impact from the proposed action is nowhere near worth all of the potential impacts of these things. So certainly overall, there seems to be a strong argument against the thinning in riparian reserves. The logging for large woody debris is a separate issue, and they didn't go much into that as far as impacts go. It sounds like they're planning on taking trees with their root systems attached and actually felling them and putting them into these streams. I think what should be suggested is just that they don't do that within riparian reserves. They need to get those specific trees from somewhere else that's not vulnerable and not potentially impacting the very streams that they're trying to enhance. So I think that's one direction you can go with it, because introducing large woody debris into riparian areas is not an issue. It does improve stream habitat, and over time it will happen naturally. But I think what we need to ask them is, why would we try to enhance riparian reserves using tree felling in riparian reserves that would negatively impact habitat quality? It all just seems kind of convoluted. So things to consider, and certainly not the full extent of the analysis, but if you feel like there are certain points in here that you want to dig into deeper, I think these are some great jumping off points. And you can go in and sort of read these sections for yourself. And I would definitely encourage you to look at the cited sources that they use. Most of the time you can go on Google and find them. A lot of the time they'll have the URL for where they got the document actually in the bibliography. So most of them are available online for free. And if they cite it in their document and it's not available online for free, you can't find it anywhere, you can email them and tell them, like, I need access to this document because you've cited it and I don't have access to review this information. And they'll send it to you. So with that said, we will close out with some questions. But first, I'd like to give some thanks to our awesome host and Parks Associate Director, Courtney, who you met earlier at the beginning of the call. Our lovely volunteer organizer, Mia Paisano, who has organized all of these comment writing workshops related to Zigzag, and has really put a lot of time into coordinating all of this stuff, and kind of herding cats here, trying to get us all on Zoom calls at the right time and on the right resources, and getting summaries written up and things. So a lot of work went in there. And of course, acknowledging the Indigenous peoples who were the original stewards of this land and who certainly have managed these resources differently than the Forest Service is managing them, and who really should have more say in these processes. But we do need to acknowledge that the fact that we're even sitting here and talking about these areas that we frequently go into to recreate, and which are now owned by the federal government, were once the land of our Native peoples of this area. So give thanks to them, and thanks to these lovely coho here, who hopefully will not be impacted by this project. So we'll go into any of your thoughts about these things. Definitely feel free if you saw anything in the analysis that you're like, oh, I have ideas about that, or anything like that, or if you have questions and you want to go into stuff more. We have a good amount of time.
Hey, Ashley, this is Dennis Boardman.
Hello, Dennis.
this is my first time doing this, but I've written some of these comments out of in the past. But I had just one question in the document you were talking early. One of your earlier slides was wood recruitment potential. What is that?
It's basically so recruitment is
timber harvest.
Wood recruitment potential. They were talking about it in the context of the lack of large woody debris. It's basically saying what's the potential for this forest to provide the large woody debris naturally for the stream. So basically, wood recruitment would be wood falling into the stream. So wood recruitment potential is basically how likely it is that any of the trees in the riparian area currently would fall into the stream and create that large woody debris that they're looking for. So what they want to see is a higher woody debris recruitment potential. And right now they're seeing a low recruitment potential because a lot of the trees, they were saying a lot of the trees are too healthy and too young in these riparian areas. And so they're not like having big branches or entire trees fall into the streams right now. And so they're wanting to intervene because it'll take, like they said, like 50 to 100 years for those trees to reach an age, like a life stage where they'll be able to start falling into the stream. So yeah, recruitment potential is just how likely is it that those debris will occur naturally.
And then does that tie into some of the last things you saying? One of the things we could highlight is don't take them from beside the stream, take them from hundreds of yards away or a half a mile away or something where there's less issues.
Yeah, it's taking them from farther away, it wouldn't enhance the recruitment potential of the riparian area, but it would limit the impacts basically of taking those trees from areas close to the streams and felling them and putting them into the stream. So if they take them from farther away outside of these riparian reserves, then we're eliminating the potential for impact. Because taking the large woody debris and artificially putting it into the stream is not a concern, but the concern is where you're getting the trees from. And they're basically just saying right now, the riparian reserves aren't able to do that for themselves. They aren't able to have that wood fall into the streams naturally. But I think one of the modifications to this project would be not taking those woody debris from the riparian reserves themselves, but taking them from somewhere else in the project to reduce impacts to the streams.
So Ashley, we do have a few questions in the chat.
Okay.
But one thing struck me about this question about the trade-off between the impact to soils and sedimentation from the logging, where the result would be to use those logs in the stream, is that, you know, those forests, as they describe them, aren't aged enough to start falling into the stream, largely because this area was logged 50 years ago and 70 years ago and 100 years ago. So there haven't, trees in that area haven't been left standing long enough to reach that natural recruitment stage where there's plenty of trees, elder trees, like falling on a regular basis. So they're kind of dealing with a mess that was created by previous management. And I wonder how we can bring that into the conversation or into our arguments. Just like maybe you could let that simmer. But in the chat, there are a few questions. I'll let you answer them, and like if you want to take a look in your own order. One is, do they publish confidence intervals or margin of error on their stats? And then Camilo's is, if the work pushes those percentages of the concern, the levels of concern, how can that be addressed? If you want to make that argument of you're pushing us closer to that threshold of concern, how do you actually make a strong argument against that, since it's not crossing the threshold, and they're kind of saying if as long as it doesn't cross the threshold, we're going to go for it.
Right. Yeah.
And
Definitely
Mia has
good
a question
question.
too, but it's just as a question, so I'll let Mia get to that one maybe here in a few minutes. Mia.
Okay. I'll start with the first one about confidence intervals. They're not required to do that by any means. They're not required to publish those with the data that they include. But most of the information that I used was from the water quality specialist report and the fisheries specialist report. So if you want to see specifically each model that they used, if they included those or not, then I would just kind of go in there and you get the data. But specifically for these metrics, like we're talking about sediment concentration and things like that, they basically just put tables. They didn't actually show their work or show any confidence intervals for how they achieved those numbers. So
thanks. Actually, that was my question, because I think that's a major weakness. So if you're at 12%, I almost guarantee you that's within a margin of error of 15%. That's
right. Yeah. I mean, I think that
ridiculous.
Yeah, it's a good point. It definitely ties into the second question too, about how do we frame this, about like we're really close to this threshold of concern. So I think that's a great argument to include is, well, if we're saying Muddy Creek is at 12% unstable banks, trying to quantify these things, something like an unstable bank, you're never going to be exactly at 12%. Like it's not something that's directly quantifiable like that. These are all very subjective models, mathematical models that they're using, and obviously subject to change with environmental conditions and stuff like that. So I think that's a great way to frame your comment and really question the integrity of their analysis is, well, what is the confidence interval of this 12%? Could it be 15? Because if it is, then it's within the threshold. And that's something that needs to be considered. So these very subjective models that they're using that are trying to quantify natural resources and things like sedimentation and slope stability and stuff that are really hard to quantify. Certainly, I think asking them to show their work a little bit more is important. They do go into the methods quite a bit in both of the specialist reports, the fisheries and the water quality one, but not necessarily to the point of saying, well, 12 could be 15. They don't say that. They don't bring that possibility into it. So presenting these numbers as concrete facts, I think is a little, I don't want to say disingenuous, but it's a little misleading and doesn't necessarily paint the full picture of the potential impacts. So I think that's a great point. And if you'd like me to expand on the second question more, I can, but I think that Tim, you kind of answered it for me with that. The confidence intervals would probably be the best way to do it, or just in general, asking them to acknowledge the fact that these are not set numbers when you're trying to quantify natural resources. So
I think it may be another part of this question is if they're wrong, and the action does push this thing over its threshold of concern, what is what happens then? Like, is there any accountability for them having had a bigger impact than they said they were going to have or than they assessed?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard because like we were talking about earlier, NEPA doesn't require outcomes, it only requires disclosure. So even if they said all of these streams are above the threshold of concern for sedimentation and bank stability and things like that, and they could very likely likely to adversely affect these federally threatened fish species, even if they came to that determination after we call them out on this sketchy data, I think it's not necessarily a direct correlation to the outcome of the project changing. It's what it would do is it would trigger Fish and Wildlife Service, and their management directive is to preserve these species. It's also the Fish and Wildlife Service's directive, but particularly, Forest Service, but particularly Fish and Wildlife, it would trigger their involvement a little bit more. And I think that they would then have to issue, from my knowledge of NEPA, I think that what would happen is they would have to go to Fish and Wildlife, and Fish and Wildlife would have to issue what's called a biological assessment. And biological assessment is basically Fish and Wildlife looking at all of the potential impacts to federally listed species under the Endangered Species Act, which is what they're concerned with, and saying these effects would, these actions would have like this type of effect, and if that's the case, they would prescribe mitigation or suggest altering the project. So I think that's the direction that it could go if the effect determination were to change from may affect not likely to adversely affect to likely to adversely affect. But that's not always the case. So I think what it would do is at least make an argument for an objection later if the Forest Service chose to not change the project at all or perform any mitigation related to all of these things being above threshold of concern now. So could go, yeah, one of two ways: people having to object to it later, or them actually taking care of it in their final environmental assessment.
Mia, did you want to ask your terminology question?
Yeah. So in one of your early slides, Ashley, you were talking about the percentage clear cut, and what was that study? Price and somebody?
Oh, this one?
Yeah.
Perry and Jones.
Yeah, Perry and Jones. So I'm noticing that they're using the terminology clear cut here, which the Forest Service in this proposal and in all of their documents, they don't touch that term with a 10-foot pole. And whenever we use the terminology clear cut, they give us all kinds of pushback about, oh, we don't do that anymore. There's no clear cutting here. There's regeneration harvest or shelterwood harvest. So is this the, did you pull this from the specialist report, and are they using this language talking about clear cut?
Yeah, this is a screenshot of the report. Yeah, it's just like a photo pasted in here, a screenshot of it. But what I think happened was maybe a little bit of a slip on their part if they're actively trying to avoid the term clear cut, because this is text, I think it's literally directly from the abstract. When I was reading it, it was almost verbatim. And they, in the Perry and Jones paper, they do use the term clear cut, and they explicitly say in that paper that regeneration harvest is the term used to describe clear cutting activities. So in that paper, they say that. And whoever was writing this specialist report maybe didn't get the memo that you're not supposed to say clear cut, and just copy pasted what that paper said. So they have acknowledged it. We now have on paper from the Forest Service something saying clear cut. And yeah, this Perry and Jones paper says regeneration harvest equals clear cut in it. So now we have an argument anytime they try to pull that.
Yeah, good. Well, Perry and Jones just did us a solid in that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Ashley.
So we have met our time commitments for sitting in this workshop and learning all the ins and outs of this project and the public comment process. There's one more question in the chat, and then we'll close it out. There is going to be follow-up information sent out, and we'll be posting this recording and documents and other resources to help you write your comments on the BARC website. So you'll get an email that directs you to that. The last question here is trying to understand the situation where they're logging for their quota, but then they're going to put the wood in the rivers to be restoration project, and what's going on there. Mia, I think you can probably speak to this a little bit too. Other barkers, other people with experience could pipe up for this part, but Ashley, why don't you go ahead and give us your 2 cents on that?
Sure, yeah, so the proposed, here, I'll go to the proposed action real quick so we have it up. So there's 2 different actions proposed here. So there's the large woody debris that they want to put into streams for habitat enhancement. And then there's thinning, which equals harvest. Selective harvest, so not clear cut, but like I think it's a 15% canopy reduction. So they would thin 15% of the trees out of that area, and some of those trees would be put into the streams as large woody debris, but the rest of them would be taken as harvest. So they do have quotas to meet, and the other project or the other areas of the project that are not in these riparian habitats, where they're proposing all of this other logging, those would all contribute to their what they call board feet requirements for how much harvest they have to do. So the harvest is part of it, but they would just be taking a small fraction, very small fraction of the overall harvest and using that for the large woody debris habitat enhancement. So yeah, it's both, but much larger proportion of this is intended for the harvest, for the timber sale, and a very small portion is actually the habitat enhancement part, even though it's framed as though this project is primarily for habitat enhancement.
And keep in mind, right now we're just talking about the part of the project that describes what they want to do related to riparian areas and aquatic and stream concerns.
Yeah.
But there are other features of the project, other things they want to do. They want to build roads. They have a larger harvest and timber, log production goals in it. And so we have the other 5 workshops to kind of go into each piece of that. But the project as a whole is going to say, over here we want to do this, and these are the tools we'll use. And over here we're going to do something else, and here are the tools we'll use. We have a couple other volunteers here tonight who are leading those other workshops, and maybe they could say a piece about what people could expect from those. And Lloyd, I saw your hand.
A quick question on what you're touching on. When we write these letters, since the workshops are set up independently, is it tradition to stick to these? Like when you write your one letter, or can you write more than one letter, or do you stick to one category in a letter based on the workshops?
You mean like your final comment that you're going to be submitting?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, you can touch on every topic that they cover if you want.
In one letter.
Yeah. There's
Okay.
no restriction at all to what you put into your comment. We're just breaking them up into different resources because it's a lot easier to kind of isolate them and look at them.
Yeah, okay, that's all I need to know. That was good. Okay, thank you.
Next Wednesday, I'll be leading the vegetation workshop, which will go into like kind of broader what their prescriptions for different types of harvest are, and going into, similar, like picking through the EA about what it really means, what they think the effects will be. But yeah, outside of riparian zones, which are mostly in an area, will be managed mainly for timber harvest.
And then this is Mia chiming in. And then a week from tomorrow, I'm going to do one of these workshops on an overview. So we'll really do a grab bag of looking at the big picture, and then some of the kind of quirky little details in the project, and then participants who show up who have special burning interests will try to focus on those a bit. So it'll be a little bit of a grab bag in my workshop. And then tomorrow night, we're gonna do roads and the transportation system. Courtney is going to do recreation, and Brenna, the Bark staff attorney, is going to talk about climate.
1 tomorrow and then 3 next week. Those are all posted on the Facebook and in your Bark emails if you get our email blasts. So I hope to see folks again, and also please share this information with your friends and colleagues and family. We really want to have the public contributing lots of substantive comments to the Forest Service. They do feel the pressure when the pressure is delivered in a very clear, concise, objective, scientifically based, project-specific way. So look for this follow-up email that will have a packet of resources and the recordings. And thank you so much. One of these days we will hopefully see you in the forest again as well.